I'm a pretty huge fan of Chinese literature. I try to read as much Chinese literature in translation as I do Korean and Japanese. Unfortunately, we just don't get as much Chinese literature translated into English on a yearly basis, as things stand right now at least. However, in spite of how much I enjoy Chinese literature, I had never ever come across the works or even the name of Zou Jingzhi. Zou Jingzhi is a huge name in Chinese literature. He's a screenwriter, a playwright, a poet, he's written essays and novels, and he even founded a theatre collective. And yet I'd never heard of him. But now, if you're in the same boat as me, we all get to. Thanks to Ninth Building. Ninth Building is translated by Jeremy Tiang, who is one of the great Chinese to English translators working today, and it's published by my friends Honford Starr, who repeatedly put out some of the greatest works in translation from East Asia that you can find. Now, Zou Jingzhi has written a lot of stuff, and he's written in all kinds of forms. As I said, he's written screenplays and poetry and novels. This is something entirely unique. I would call it literature, but it's not fiction. It is written in a style reminiscent of prose, and it does kind of read like a novel, but it is about Zou Jingzhi's own life. Zou Jingzhi grew up in the Cultural Revolution, and there are plenty of works of Chinese fiction and non-fiction that explore that time period. Many years ago, I read Zheng Chang's Wild Swans, which is a huge book that I'm sure a lot of you have read. Wild Swans is an incredible triple-generation biography of 3 women growing up through the 20th century in China, pre-Cultural Revolution, during the Cultural Revolution, and kind of after it. I love Wild Swans, and it refocused my understanding of 20th century China after I had lived there for a year and come home. I'm very grateful to Zheng Chang for that book, and I've read a few other books since, some fiction, some non-fiction, that are set during this time period, and Ninth Building is another one. As I said, Zou Jingzhi grew up during the Cultural Revolution. The book is set in 2 parts. The first half is his childhood in Beijing, before he's a teenager. He's in Beijing, the Cultural Revolution is kind of setting in and getting underway. And that half is his life as a child would see it. He's trying to capture the feeling, the emotions, what he understood, how he felt, and the perspective of a child at that time. So it has a very limited and narrow focus, and doesn't focus on grand politics because a child wouldn't understand those things. In the second half, his family is cast out from Beijing, and Zou Jingzhi has to go live in the wastelands of northern China, and he has to go and work and till the soil and break his back doing hard labor all the way through his teen years and into his early 20s. And that's what Ninth Building covers. Those 2 time periods in his life, his childhood and his adolescence into adulthood. It is all about his personal life, so it is non-fiction, but it is written with a very clear and distinct narrative, and it feels like prose broken up into little vignettes. I'm not going to say chapters. They're vignettes. They are little glimpses into the life and experiences of this young man. And they don't have a clear narrative through line. It's not like a diary where each day follows the previous. It is more just moments throughout these years, through his childhood, moments that are worth reflecting on. And in that sense, there's something so poetic about it, because every single vignette, every section of this book, and most of them are about 5 or 6 pages long, they all serve a purpose. They are all very specific memories that he holds dear for one reason or another. Some of them are really beautiful and sweet. A lot of them are about friendship, the bonds that he makes with the men and women he's surrounded by. Others are cripplingly sad. Some of them are about death and loss. There are some that feature the deaths of people he knows, other times the deaths of animals he's come to know. There's a lot of sorrow here. There's a lot of sadness when it comes to what is available to these people, their living situation, the working conditions, what food they can eat, how they spend their days, etc., etc. If you know anything about the Cultural Revolution, you can kind of picture what it's like. But what's unique about it is this 2-half approach, where in the first half you get to see what Beijing was like. In the stories I've read, whether true or not, they are usually focused on smaller towns and neighborhoods, and here you're getting Beijing, you're getting the capital, and what it was like for this writer in his childhood. One thing that stuck out to me right from the beginning is the fact that he talks a lot about people betraying one another, encouraged by the government to kind of have a vigil watch, an eye focused on everyone around yourself and your family, and maybe even within your family. And this is something that happened in Nazi Germany as well with the Hitler Youth. People would be encouraged to tattle on each other if they thought that they had a reason to, and may even make one up. There was always this thing of being afraid of being perceived as bourgeois, the intelligentsia being thrown out, cast out, put in prison, put in work camps. And so over and over again, you've got this child's perspective where all he knows to do is tattle on other people that he thinks might be part of the bourgeoisie. That's pretty much it. If anyone seems to be too educated or too knowledgeable in some way, you might tattle on them and get them thrown out of the city or thrown in jail. And you can tell from the way he writes it, this child doesn't understand why, because why would he? And I love the fact that he captures that childish perspective. There is not a lot of context given here. If you happen to know nothing about Mao's Cultural Revolution, you're going to be quite confused by the content of this, because it does kind of assume you know the basics of what went down and what it was like for people living through that time period. I don't know everything, but I've read a few books and I know enough. But that child perspective is what makes it so endearing. And of course, as well, you can see parallels between the attitudes of the people at the beginning of the Cultural Revolution and people now in places like the UK and the US, where being overeducated or being too smart or being too knowledgeable about politics seems to be a dangerous thing these days. We are moving as a culture, especially in the West, more and more towards the right, more and more towards fascism. And as you read through this book, you can see the telltale signs of fascism in your own country, in your own society, and it's truly frightening. Something that I think about all of the time is the lead up to Brexit, when Michael Gove said the line, "Aren't we a little bit tired of experts?" I'm paraphrasing, I don't think that's exactly what he said, but he said something along the lines of being bored of experts, subtly instilling into the minds of ordinary people that experts, knowledgeable people, scientists, politicians who actually have a background in politics shouldn't be trusted. People who can do their research, people with a background and understanding in things, are not to be trusted by the ordinary Joe. And that is what happened in the Cultural Revolution. That's what happened in Nazi Germany. And it's happening again now. It's been happening since Brexit and probably far before that. So I couldn't help but see these parallels between what happened to ordinary people in the Cultural Revolution and their relationship to the intelligentsia, the bourgeoisie, whatever you want to call them, whatever slang term you want to use. There are connections between that and what's happening now, especially from my perspective in the UK and the US. Now, the second half is larger than the first, which means it's not a half, Will. Part 2 is larger than part 1. And I think it's more interesting because it's now from the perspective of a teenager, a young adult, someone who is definitely understanding his world a lot more. He's no longer an ignorant child. He understands what's going on. He understands his current lot in life, and it's a really terrible one. But it's a far more poetic section. Part 1, child's perspective, not a lot of insight, just something very fascinating about the perspective. But in the second half, he's now savvy, and he's also very artistic, he's musical, he likes to write, he likes to explore creative avenues. And so you're getting poetry from his perspective, you're getting philosophy. A lot of the vignettes in part 2 kind of end with a phrase that feels like a moral of the story, or just a piece of poetic insight. A thing happened, a sad thing happened to someone, this is what I'm taking away from it. Very moral of the story, very beautiful, a little tiny bit of philosophy or poetry right at the end that just really captured the whole scene and what he was learning from it and what he was taking away. Rather than wallowing in misery, which of course he did a lot of the time, he was also learning, he also had his eyes open, and he was also looking at what he can kind of take away from this situation. What has he learned? How is this going to influence his life? Blah, blah, blah. It's really beautiful stuff, and it definitely betrays a creative spirit. And I really love that about him. I grew to really enjoy him as a character, and I grew to like some of the people around him, although you don't get to know them personally and intimately that well. But you also do, even in very short spans of time. You might not learn the names of the people around him, but you kind of learn their attitudes and you understand their lot and their situation. It's a very, very engrossing and captivating piece of literature. Also, I should say at the very end, this is about 250 pages long. After that, you get a few poems by Zou Jingzhi at the end. And They're lovely. They are a kind of insight into what he was creating as an artist after he left this life, after he returned to Beijing. You get to see, okay, so this is the artist that was carved out of these experiences. Here are the experiences. This is his childhood and his adolescence, and now we're seeing his poetry, which is the product of his youth, his experience, his exile. Now, you don't get a clear picture of everything that happens. Between parts 1 and 2, his father is cast into prison, I think, and he is exiled into the wastes. You don't really get to see why and how that happened and what it was like for his family. You just kind of see him as a child in Beijing, and then you see him in the wastes. It mentions them at the train station and how his father was allowed out of prison for like half an hour to see his family off as they were cast out into the wasteland. And that's kind of it. And you don't get a lot of context, but you don't need it. This is about specific situations, specific moments in his life that are emblematic of the world he lived in, the country, the culture, the political climate, and also things that inspired and molded him as a creator, an artist, as an adult. And now I'm so intrigued to read more of his poetry, to read his novels, to watch the films that he's written, because I now understand the person and the experiences of that person who then became that artist. So I need to see the art. I need to watch the plays and the films. I hope I can get my hands on some of them, because this guy is an incredible artist just based on the poems I read. And I'm really, really excited to see what kind of art he created. It's a weird thing to basically read the biography of someone whose art you've never consumed, because usually we're fans of artists, and then we read or watch documentaries on their life because we're interested in how they became that creator. But I've done it in reverse here, and that's kind of intriguing to me. Ninth Building is an absolutely fascinating piece of literature, and I urge everyone to go read it. If you're a fan of Chinese history, Chinese literature, you're kind of getting both wrapped into one thing here. It's fantastic. It'll move you to tears at certain moments, and it will make you laugh because there's a lot of dark comedy in here as well, and I really respect that. Please check this out. Support Humford Starr, Jeremy Tiang, and everyone else who went into creating this. Zou Jingzhi is awesome, and I'm going to check out what else of his I can get my hands on. Subscribe for books.